covering smart versus dumb components. Before we get into that, I need to give you a little bit of an update. I recently went under a job change, so I've been a little away from my responsibilities here for my YouTube channel. I also realized that the long series of videos wasn't necessarily very useful to my viewership, but instead I'll be doing a little bit more of one-off topics, and hopefully as time goes on build up a repertoire of videos and then bunch them all into lessons. So with that being said, we're going to get into smart versus dumb components, which will be the first video of these more random topics. We'll start off by defining what a smart component is. A smart component makes service calls to get data to display on the view. In addition, they're concerned with how things work as opposed to how they look. They're typically complex components in comparison due to the above. They need to understand the services, what data to fetch in order to run the application, etc. It also maintains application state. It's aware of where the user came from, what interactions they've done, the service responses, etc. There are a few pros to using smart components. They can be dropped into an application with very little wiring, mostly because that logic is built into the component itself. This means that they're typically represented very cleanly in the DOM. As far as Angular is concerned, you'll have an element definition with probably 1 to 0 bindings. So viewing this type of smart component in the DOM is very easy to pick up. There are, however, several cons associated with smart components. It must have intimate knowledge of the API, meaning it needs to know in what order to make the service calls, how to handle responses, etc. They're also very tightly coupled to these services. If a service failure occurs, the component will fail, and if a service changes, that component will typically have to change with each and every one of the service changes. It also needs to ensure that the proper application state exists in order to make that service call. So it needs to ensure that let's say there's a URL parameter that needs to be defined, or there needs to be some step that had happened before. It needs to have this logic baked into it, which typically complicates the component. They're also very difficult to customize. Because they're tied so tightly to the services, such as which properties come back from which object in the service response, if that API ever changes, then it needs to reflect that, and that also means that you can't pass in just a generated object from another service call. You have to ensure that that service call represents exactly what you want. And there's very little reuse due to this. It can only represent one concept from one data source because that data source is built into the component itself. If you were able to feed the data to it, it would be able to give you the same look and feel and interactions, but from two different data sources potentially. Next, we're going to talk about dumb components. These are purely presentational components. They're concerned with how things look on the screen. They rely on data being passed in from a stateful parent component or a smart component. There are a few pros associated with dumb components. They do not care where the data comes from as long as it's properly formatted. So you can feed a dumb component from any number of different data sources. They're also very simplistic. Most have no logic in them whatsoever other than handling callbacks or simple data formatting. They also have no knowledge of the API and can easily adapt to change. Because they're not baked into what a service response looks like, you can simply handle that API change on the smart component level, which is already making those service calls anyway. The only con I could come up with for a dumb component is that it needs to be wired up as opposed to simply placed in the DOM. This can lead to a little bit of difficulty in maintaining these things because if you need to add a feature, you need to potentially add another data source from the parent, and additional bindings are required. Dumb components can handle interactions such as clicks and hovers and the like, but it should not be the one responsible for making the service calls. Callbacks should be used to trigger calls in smart components or their parent. Next, I'm going to talk about the best practices. When it comes to smart versus dumb components, entire applications should be written as a single component. The fewer smart components, the better. This typically means that you have fewer areas of complexity in your application. Smart components can be made dumb by breaking into two components: a smart wrapper component that binds the results of service calls into a dumb component. That way, if you ever decide to move that service call into a parent component, it's easier to make that move from that one smart wrapper that didn't really actually do anything other than feed the data into the dumb component. Lastly, I want to wrap this up by saying thank you for bearing with me with this long pause. I appreciate the viewership. You can always contact me on LinkedIn and Twitter, and I'd like to also say that I started a blog. This probably goes further in depth into many of the thoughts that I have, including topics that I didn't feel would warrant a YouTube video. In fact, this particular video has further in depth in my blog as well. If you want to check it out, feel free to. You can click on the link down below in the description. Thank you, and I will see you for the next video.